Hey friends, this is Darnell coming to you once again from the beautiful Bedrock Ministry studio with another edition of America in Bible Prophecy. Now, in the last teaching video titled Two Coming World Leaders, we talked about those two world leaders, one being the Antichrist and one being the false prophet. They're clearly talked about in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we sort of broke it down for you to where we could understand that the Antichrist will generally be a political leader, where the false prophet will be a religious leader. You see, the devil recognizes that if he is going to ultimately bring the world under the submission of one man, that one man being the Antichrist, in whom he will divest all of his power, he has to appeal to not only the political structure of the world, but also the religious structure of the world. Because the fact of the matter is religion is a big deal in the hearts and minds of men and women, not only today, but it always has been. So what we're going to see is this continued push, as we have over the past couple decades or so, to bring the world under a more of an international community, because ultimately, if the world is going to be governed by one governing body and ultimately led by one person, then there has to be, for that to happen, there has to be a breakdown of this structure of the world that we have always seen, which is this individual nationalism. That's why what we've seen in Europe with the European Union, these smaller nations coming together and looking at what the United States did, where it's states that have come together as a republic under one banner. They've sort of copied that and tried to bring Europe, the European nations, under one banner. And we see this move going forward, and it's just this continued effort to try to break down sovereign nations, individual nations, and bring them sort of all together, because ultimately the plan is to bring the world under the rule of the Antichrist. Now, religion has a similar dynamic going on, because religion religious passions, if I can put it this way, run deep in the hearts and minds of men and women. People are willing to die in many cases for what they believe in. And so for the world to all kind of converge in under one ruler, there has to be an effort to bring the religious world under that same sort of movement where it's all coming together. And in fact, that is exactly what's happening. Now, I'll get into more of this later in terms of introducing what's really going on in the world, because I know a lot of people aren't paying attention and they don't realize that there has been a move going on to bring religions all together. This is something that's already been in the works. There are meetings being held in the world that have brought a lot of different religious leaders together and tried to sort of form this coalition to where there will, and ultimately it will succeed for the most part. There will be a world religion. So I won't get too far into that today, but you just for now kind of have to take my word for it that this is a move that's going on. So that's the plan. Bring all religions under one umbrella and have it sort of a world religion, and all nations under one umbrella and have it sort of be a world governmental system and have them come together. Now, this is a model that we saw with the revised Holy Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire, which was in power when Christ was on the earth, and in fact is really what destroyed the Second Temple. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple. The Roman Empire kind of fizzled out. We went into the Dark Ages, and then And then we've seen this revised Holy Roman Empire come back to sort of be rebirthed, if you will. And that's an interesting dynamic. But really, what it is it's the marrying of religion and politics. This is why you've seen over the course of several years now the Pope being brought more to the forefront as he speaks out on even political issues and things that are going on in the world. There's things working, my friends, that are totally consistent with the prophetic timeline if you understand what is really going on. Now, let's just talk about religion for a moment. If I were to ask you what is the largest religion in the world, what would you think? Well, if you just sort of Google that largest religion in the world, what's going to come up is probably the first thing that'll come up. It'll say, I saw one that said as of 2010, there were 2.2 billion Christians in the world. Okay, which would make Christianity the largest, as of 2010, religion in the world. But you break that down and look beneath those numbers a little bit, and you find something very interesting. One of the things that you find is that included in that 2.2 billion Christians, that in that banner is also is Catholics and Christians. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because Catholicism and Christianity, when I say Christianity in terms of its roots, you might remember I said in an earlier video that to correctly interpret end-time Bible prophecy, you have to have a knowledge of not only the scriptures, but you also have to have a knowledge of world history, and you have to have a knowledge of current world events. Those three things are absolutely necessary. So if we look at the history of the church, for example, Christianity and Catholicism, when Christ came to the earth and they started with 12 disciples and they began to spread the gospel and spread Christianity throughout the known world at that time, not too far down the road, and I won't get into I'm going to teach more on this and more definitively and more exhaustively later, but just to kind of give you a quick overview, there came a time when there was a split between those that were considered, hardcore, true, hardline Christians that really adhered to the teachings of the first disciples, and this other religion that sort of began to emerge as time went on. It ultimately became Catholicism, but there was a division there. And that division got so stark and went in such an opposite direction that there became conflict. And the point came in history when Roman Catholicism, now this is just history, so don't shoot the messenger here, but I'm just telling you history. There was a time when Roman Catholicism persecuted Christians, persecuted those true followers of the teachings of Christ. In fact, brutally. There were many deaths that occurred. Again, I'll get into some more extensive teaching on that later, but what I'm trying to point out to you for the sake of this video is that when we look at that number, 2.2 billion Christians, we're looking through that number through the lens of a world that sort of lumps all of that together. And one of the things that I am going to attempt to do, and in fact do for you going forward, is I'm really going to begin to break down, these numbers a little bit and look at, what is just religion and what is true Christianity, because I will contend that true Christianity is the Christianity of the Bible. So when we start looking at politics, when we start looking at religion, and I'm talking about all religions, I don't care who they are. There's no No safe space in this conversation. I'm gonna look at it through the lens of what does the scripture say, because I would contend that a lot of people have a God that they've sort of dreamt up in their mind, or even a Jesus that they've sort of dreamt up in their mind that is not consistent with the God and with the Jesus of the Bible. And as you know, I'm a word person. So at the end of the day, if it's not word, if it's not Bible, then it is a counterfeit. So the Bible teaches that there will be a one world religion. Now, the question becomes, how in the world would we bring all religions together, especially when you look across the landscape, the religious landscape, and see what we see today? Let's break this down a little bit more. If you set up aside that 2.2 billion Christian number that I just gave you, on researching this question, another thing you'll find out is that the fastest growing religion today is in fact Islam. Now the numbers range depending on where you look, between 1.6, 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. Now that's a big number. That's a huge number. If you just type in the question on a simple Google search, how many Roman Catholics are there in the world? You will get numbers that range between 1.2, 1.6 billion. Okay, so that means that let's just break that down a little bit. If just a search on Roman Catholics gives you let's go with the conservative number. If it gives you 1.2 billion, okay, and the number on Christians in general, using the term Christian, which includes Catholics for the sake of their number, you get 2.2 billion. So you can see that if you just break the just Roman Catholics out of that Christian number, then the Christian number becomes much smaller. In other words, if you were to separate Catholicism from, say, Protestantism, then that Protestant number becomes much smaller, and the Catholic number, Catholicism, becomes much larger. Now you'll see why that is pertinent as we go forward. So now you've got Muslims and Catholicism being the two largest. Okay, the two largest. Now just put that in your back pocket for a minute. Muslims and Catholics being the two largest. Now, in the last video, when we were talking about the Antichrist and the false prophet, again, think of that in terms of Antichrist representing the political structure, and the false prophet being the leader of the religious structure. Okay, so now if we were to take those two, and then we set politics aside for a moment and we just looked at the religious component, now in the religious arm of that would ultimately, if prophecy is correct, which I would certainly argue that it is, under that religious arm, you would have being the two predominant religions being Islam and Catholicism. Okay, so I want you to kind of visualize that for a moment. That being the religious arm, those two components. Now, conversely, we look at the political structure, which is ultimately going to come under the leadership of the Antichrist. Well, ultimately, it'll all come under the leadership of the Antichrist, but first, it'll be as a political structure. Now, if I were to ask you, what are the two predominant political movements in the world today, what would you think? Well, I would argue that the United States of America is a perfect example of the division between political ideologies, because we have seen over the past few decades a almost split down the middle division, as some have gone towards socialism, which I would argue is ultimately rooted in communism. and some have gone towards capitalism. This is reflected all the way to the right and the left as we talk about Democrats and Republicans. I mean, it's that really, if you are aware of what's going on, it's that stark. So this is also a worldwide phenomenon. There's just no question that upon real careful examination, the two primary political sort of ideologies that exist in this world are capitalism and some form of communism, which again is just essentially what democratic socialism is. So now, looking at our two arms, political and religious, we've got two and two. Okay, the two political structures or political ideologies that are battling for position, if you will, in the hearts and minds of men and women are communism and capitalism. Okay, whereas the two largest religious movements in the world are Catholicism and Islam. Okay, so now that's what we've got. We've got two major arms. We've got two world leaders coming, and within those two arms, we have four ideologies that are competing in the world. Two are religious, and two are political. The four, again, break them down. We've got communism, capitalism, and then the other two are Islam and Catholicism. Now, why is this important? Why am I breaking this down for you? And why am I sort of bringing all this to your attention? Well, I'm bringing it to your attention because that is exactly what the Bible says is coming on the prophetic timeline. You say, well, where is that shown in the Bible? Well, let me take you there. Now, going back another video or two, you may remember that I was going through the structure, understanding the structure of the book of Revelation. And we talked extensively about how when Jesus first appeared to John in chapter 1 of Revelation, he said, I'm going to show you the things that must soon take place. Okay, and we talked about how that religion, another one of these areas where religion has sort of gotten it wrong as they've passed down information was this idea not only that the rapture is going to be prior to the tribulation period, which we exhaustively went through and debunked, but also that religion has said that everything prophetically written in the book of Revelation pertains to that last 7 years. So in the minds of most people, certainly most Christians, they just believe that, okay, Revelation is just, after the rapture, it's the time of, last 7 years, we won't be here anyway, so it doesn't matter. And that I clearly believe is false thinking. The Bible just doesn't say that. So when Christ said to John, the angel of the Lord said to John, I will show you the things that must soon take place, I believe there was a real reason why Jesus used that word soon. So what we saw was after John's life, when the disciples carried that new Christian message and religion began to grow. And then we saw that division that I spoke of earlier where there was another sort of religion that formed out of that ultimately became Catholicism. Well, Catholicism, now we look at as one of the forces that's competing in the world for a dominant position. I'm trying to show you where it began and what it has evolved to. Okay, where it began and what it has evolved to. Now, I'll go into much more detail on that later so that you can really get a clear picture, because if you knew what I know about world history and how that developed, it becomes more plain. But for now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to have to ask you to kind of just accept that, if you will. So, that being said, let's jump to chapter 6 in Revelation. So we talked about how chapter 4 starts more the prophetic part of the book of Revelation, but 4 and 5 just kind of describe this opening scene in heaven, what's going on. We'll look at that later, but I'm going to jump ahead to verse 6 and the opening of the seals. We've talked before about 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 vials. Well, this is the 7 seals. Now, I know we're going to run up against a time limit here on this video, so let me just sort of outline it for you, and then we'll come back and dig into it a little bit later. The first 4 seals in the Bible, they're opened. One releases a white horse, one releases a red horse, one releases a black horse, and one releases a green horse. Or the Bible says a pale horse, but we'll look at that more in a moment. Now, let's just take those 4 seals, those 4 colors, and let's go back to our structure here of a political arm and a religious arm with 2 political ideologies and 2 religious ideologies all competing. And remember what they are, and then let's sort of couple our 4 colors with our 4 ideologies. Okay, so on the political arm, you've got communism and capitalism. On the religious arm, you've got Catholicism and Islam. Now, what are our 4 colors in the 4 seals? The first one was white, the second one was red, the third one was black, and the fourth one was pale. Now, let's talk about those real quickly, okay? If I were to ask you to couple the colors with the 4 ideologies that are competing in the world, how would you break it down? Let's start with the white one. Do you think that white represents more Islam, capitalism, communism, or Catholicism? Of those 4, which would you say white represents more? Well, I'm sure that it jumped out to you pretty quick. We see the Pope wearing white. We see him in his vehicle. He's in white. We see him in his airplane. He's in white. There's almost no question to anybody that that white would represent Catholicism if we were going to match these 4 colors of the 4 first seals with these 4 ideologies that are competing in the world. Let's quickly jump to red. Okay, so we've already set aside white and Catholicism. That leaves Islam, capitalism, and communism. If you were to pick one of those to match up with red, the color of red, which would you choose? Well, to me, that was a pretty obvious question. Red matches up with communism. It's always been understood, red Russia, red China, red across the board has always been sort of consistent with representing communism. So now we've got white and we've got red. Now let's talk about black. If we've got 2 left, we've got Islam and capitalism. If you had to pick, which one would you say black would represent? Probably you're going to say capitalism, right? We think of Black Friday. What does Black Friday mean? It means that stores make enough money to take them out of the debt, out of the red, if you will, and into the black, meaning that they're thriving, that they're making money, they're profiting, which is what capitalism is all about. And when we start to break down how the Bible describes these colors, you'll see how that fits as well. You may already know if you're familiar with the Bible. So that leaves one color to be matched up with one ideology. The Bible calls the 4th seal the pale horse. Well, you say, well, how does pale represent Islam? Well, the interesting thing is that word pale, the Bible was, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the Greek word used in this verse it actually is chloros. The word chloros is actually green. It's where we get the word chloroform from, or when we talk about plants and those kinds of things. There are a couple of other verses that I could give you where the word chloros is used in the original language that the Bible was written in. Mark 6:39 talks about green grass, uses the Greek word chloros. Revelation 8:7 talking about green grass, uses the word chloros. Revelation 9:4 talks about green grass, uses the word chloros. And then that word chloros is also used in Revelation 6:8, which is the verse talking about the pale horse. So the interpreters of the Bible that interpreted it from the original Greek language to English chose pale because I'm sure they thought, well, green horse, that doesn't make much sense. There's no such thing as a green horse, so we'll call it a pale horse. But the fact of the matter is it's a chloros horse, which is actually green. And green just so happens to be the color that most predominantly represents Islam. If you look at videos on the news, videos across the Muslim world, you will see that green is their color. Now I'm going to have to leave it there for today. I feel like I'm sort of rushing through this and cutting all this very short, but time goes fast on these videos, and we have plenty of videos to come, so we'll break this down more and look more carefully at this. But just know that the developments that we see in the world, the rise of these two political and two religious ideologies, are actually very consistent with what the Bible teaches in the prophetic timeline. And if we will just understand the context of what has been laid out for us, we will see that it fits very perfectly. Hey, this is Darnell coming to you from the beautiful Bedrock Ministry studio. Now let's go change the day.